Well, now for a trip out of the studio and a rendezvous with Jim O'Hagan in Belfast City Cemetery. Jim, you've spoken to me about many of the famous Belfast citizens who are buried here in the city cemetery. Today, for a change, we've come to the cemetery, and this is really to mark the publication of a marvellous leaflet, a brochure, which you have produced all about the cemetery and its interesting historic points.
That's right, Walter. The brochure has just been published in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and really it details the background to the history of the cemetery, and it also then talks about some of the famous personages that are buried here. To trace the original history of the cemetery, we would have to go back to the days just after the 1845-47 Irish famine. And then, after that time, that resulted in quite an influx of people into Belfast. And of course, that meant there had to be increased burial space. And the city fathers at the time looked around for several sites. They looked at the Ormo Park site. They looked at the Deer Park site on the Am Road, and they eventually settled for this site that we're standing in here. This was a bleach green, and it was owned by Thomas Sinclair. Thomas Sinclair was a famous Belfast man in the 19th century. And in 1866, the Belfast Corporation, they purchased the land for £12,000.
And the location here, in fact, you can tell from the traffic noise in the background that today it's a very busy road along the Falls Road there, a lot of traffic. This is probably the noisiest part of the cemetery. I
would say so, Walter, and as I say, it's a very good point, though, to make a start on what would be an interesting little walk for us.
And this is something, of course, which you do, conduct parties of people here to take a look at it.
We do. We would do it perhaps in conjunction with the South Belfast Historical Society, perhaps about twice a year, perhaps in the clement weather that we're having today. Today is a lovely day for a walk. I hope you'll enjoy it.
And I imagine you're going to have a lot of people wanting to come now that the brochure is published.
I hope so, Walter. I hope indeed.
Now, there's a grave beside us here, which I think is our starting point, isn't it?
This is the grave, Walter, of Canon Podrick Murphy. He was the pastor of the church just opposite the cemetery, and it was always his wish to be buried in the Belfast City Cemetery because he organised Friendship Sundays when he was pastor. That was in the days whenever some of the Protestant people had stopped coming up the road due to increased tension on the Falls Road. So Canon Podrick is, I think, up to date, the only Catholic priest who's buried in the cemetery.
And this is, as you say, located right across the road from his church.
Straight across the road, and it's very, very appropriate that he's buried here, I feel, because he was a man who encouraged people to come to this cemetery, and he would have been very keen on the sort of thing we're doing today to publicise the place.
And just behind us here, there are some fairly old graves. Perhaps these were among the first graves put in here.
Well, Walter, this would have been actually a later section of the cemetery. This would have been actually round about the year 1910. From then onwards, we would have to go actually right up the cemetery to find the older graves, but I'll show you where they are.
Well, we'll take a walk along here, and gradually we'll move away from the traffic and the loud roar of traffic from the road behind us.
Exactly, here. Walter. We're coming up now to a grave quite close at hand of a famous Belfast man, the late and lamented and wonderful Willie John Ashcroft.
The solid man.
The solid man, and indeed it's on his tombstone. And we're just coming across to it now.
He was the man who ran the Alhambra Theatre.
That is right, Walter, indeed. He was owner of the Alhambra Theatre from 1878 until 1900. And he's buried up here in a very, very modest grave. And here it is, we will just walk across to it. He was a very popular man in Belfast, and as you said earlier, you will notice that it says on the stone, the solid man, proprietor of Belfast Alhambra Theatre, 1879 to 1900.
I notice now it's in the form of a Celtic cross, and there's a name at the head, at the cross of the stonework there, Laura.
Yes, Laura actually was the niece of his wife. His wife was called Kitty Brooke. and that was her name, and she retained that name. She was an actress, and she retained that name. And of course there are many stories told about the battles between Willie John and Kitty. But you know, in the end of the day, they loved each other. They stayed together, and after his death in 1918, she has her name on the other side of the stone here. Actually, the chorus of the song, it was a very popular song in its day. It was, if you like, top of the hit parade, and Willie John actually made it famous. It goes something like this: come along with me and I'll treat you decent. I'll help you up and fill your can. Sure, everyone on the street I meet says, there goes Muldoon, the solid man.
Lovely words. Well, we'll move on now, and you'll take me to another point of interest. I know that to really see everything that you would want to point out here would take quite a little while, so this is going to be a slightly truncated walk around the city cemetery.
Sure, Walter, indeed. Well, I'd be very welcome to facilitate you in any way. Just a little bit further on the same side, Walter, as Willie John is buried, is the grave of Annie Bridget. And her claim to fame is that she was the first worshipful mistress of Ireland's First Ladies LOL, #1. And she died aged 50 in 1915 on the 25th of August. That's a famous name in Orangeism, I feel, the Bridgets.
Yes, I can remember doing the commentary on the 12th. The name Bridget crops up, and I think on some of the banners too.
Exactly, yes. They were great banner painters. Now, Walter, we come to the grave of the Reverend William Maguire, which some of your listeners may well remember, or indeed they have heard of him. He was the man who was the founder of the North Belfast Mission in York Street. He died on the 12th of December 1924. He was a most charitable man in Belfast. He did an awful lot for the poor, and he deserves to be remembered on account of that.
It's quite a big grave, and I see that quite a number of members of the Maguire family are buried here.
This is what you will find, Walter, in Victorian times and in Wardian times. A lot of these people had large plots. Of course, a large plot only cost £12 in those days. You could buy a plot from £1 to £12. And of course, again, with the Victorians' sense of economy and saving, they thought of even their future burial places.
Well, Jim, when we were talking before, I think you told me that there's a lot of renovation work going here, and certainly looking around, some of the graves here are quite overgrown. Is the plan to try and improve things?
This is indeed the plan, Walter. Some of our walks have been very encouraging in that sense, that we have G'd up, if you like, the authorities to make a start. And then, of course, there's now a group called the Friends of the City Cemetery, and they are again engaged with ACE workers and people like that to do this sort of work. We now come quite hard by Mr. Maguire's grave, the grave of a very famous Belfast minister, James Ernest Davy. And James Ernest Davy was the only Irishman who was ever acquitted. Indeed, he not only acquitted, but he was accused of heresy in his own church, and subsequently acquitted in 1927. And here he lies buried. As you can see, Walter, a very humble grave for someone who in his time was considered to have been the finest scholar that Cambridge University ever produced.
And hence the inscription on the grave, a man sent from God.
Oh yes, indeed. That's John the Baptist, you see. That's the prophet, the man ahead of his time. And of course, Principal Davy, who was the principal of Assemblies College and moderator of the General Assembly, would epitomise that very much. We are now, Walter, at the grave of Mrs. Margaret Byers, who was the founder of Belfast Victoria College. She was born on the 15th of April 1832 and died on the 21st of February 1912. A famous lady in her day, indeed one of the few ladies who reached prominence in Ireland in the 19th century, and indeed one of the very few of them who are buried in the Belfast City Cemetery. She did an awful lot for the education of women in Ireland, and indeed in her time was considered to be the foremost lady in Ireland.
And you were telling me it'd be worth telling her story sometime.
Very, very much so, Walter. She deserves a story. I'm sure your listeners would find it awfully interesting. Walter, we're now walking across, would you believe it, an underground wall in the cemetery.
This is a little, at the present where we're standing, a grassy area between the graves, but there's a wall underneath here.
You wouldn't believe it, Walter. There's a 9-foot sunken wall here with a 6-foot trench across. And the history of it's very, very interesting. It was the original dividing wall between the Catholic and the Protestant parts of the cemetery. When the cemetery was opened in 1869, plans were made to accommodate 15 acres of the cemetery for the Catholic people of Belfast. But the scheme never actually came to fruition because the Catholic people had disputes with the Belfast Corporation as to who had ultimate burial rights in the cemetery. The bishop at the time, Dr. Dorian, wanted to have the ultimate right of saying a certain person was a Catholic before they could get buried in this section. And so the scheme never got off the ground. The only remnant of it today is this wall, which again, we were just walking across it as like a piece of grass, but it's most interesting.
And I see some people are working at it at the moment down at the far end.
Yeah, they're doing a little bit of excavating, I think, of the wall, because the wall can be actually seen if one walks right down to there. It's a most interesting facet of this. You see, this wall was to stretch right up from bottom to top up the cemetery, but only 100 yards of it were actually completed. And it cost something like £420 to build in 1867-68.
Jim, we've come up to a major intersection of some of the roadways through the city cemetery, and to a very imposing grave indeed, with the name Cunningham on it.
This, Walter, is the Cunningham family vault. It's a most impressive memorial. And as I say, these were the people who were institutional in starting up the Northern Whig in Belfast. They're the Whig people, and I think their family are still existing as stockbrokers in Belfast. But as I say, it's a magnificent plot altogether. Walter, we're standing hard by a grave of the Shillington family, who were famous people in Belfast. I believe that Morris Shillington, though I don't think he's buried here, was an old colleague of yours.
He was senior announcer for many years, and yes, I don't think he's buried here, but this is the old family grave.
It's his, because it says Shillington of Glenmackin, and I think Morris lived up in that part of Belmont at the time, so that's how I traced that.
That was the family house.
Yes.
Yeah.
And near the Shillington grave is the grave of Elisha Scott. Elisha Scott was a famous Belfast footballer. He was in the mould of Pat Jennings, as great a player as Pat Jennings in his time. He still played for Ireland at the age of 42 years of age. And before he played for Belfast Celtic, he was actually the famous goalkeeper of Liverpool Football Club, where he was the idol of Merseyside and the idol of the Cup there. Now, he's buried in the grave here, but there's no name on the grave. But as I say, it's in a way, it's a fitting memorial that he's buried up near what I call, in many ways, the pantheon of the cemetery, all the very important people in the cemetery, because he certainly was a very important person.
Yes, because we've just moved up a little bit from that grave, and there's the grave of Robert Baird, and of course that's the telegraph connection, isn't it?
Famous man in his day too, Walter, famous Ulsterman, very tolerant Ulsterman. He was actually the owner of the Belfast Telegraph from 1886 until 1934. And it's amazing too when you think there we are standing here on a nice quiet day, the grave a bit overgrown, and when he died, the whole Northern Ireland cabinet were standing around the grave, just where we were. The great and the good were here of that time. He was a most tolerant and fair-minded and a very good employer.
And you say it's a nice quiet area. There's the bird song, because there are a lot of trees around here, and the traffic, the roar of the traffic is a bit muted up here, and the birds take over.
That's right, Walter. Thankfully it has abated. Yes, it has indeed. Right straight up in front of us, on the same side, is the grave of Richard Rutledge Kane, the famous Belfast minister, Church of Ireland minister, famous man in that he was very much associated with the Unionist cause, and yet he was a Gaelic leaguer at the same time. Most interesting man. We did a story about him in the last series.
Well, Jim, this has been quite a short visit to the city cemetery and a quick walk around to see some of the graves that you've been telling me about over the past few months. This pamphlet, it tells the history of the city cemetery, and it also points out some of the famous graves. Where can people get it?
Well, Walter, for anyone who's interested in getting a copy, they can contact the Belfast City Council, Parks and Amenities section at Cecil Ward Building, 4 to 10 Linen Hall Street, Belfast. Telephone 01232 320 202. And I'm sure they'd be pleased there to give them whatever number of copies they wish.
And for those who'd like to go on one of the walking tours around the city cemetery, how do they arrange that?
Well, Walter, I mean, I'd be available any time if they would like to. They'd like to contact me at any stage. We run these through the auspices of the South Belfast Historical Society. I'd be contactable in Belfast, 617-116, for any organisation or group of people who would like to have a walk round. And it could be, I'm sure we could mutually agree a date and a time.
Well, that was Jim O'Hagan. And now on the phone, Roy Hamilton has a preview for us of the second Ollie McGilloway Autumn School. Good afternoon, Roy.